So you talked about the importance of transparency. How is transparency important for youth and for you to understand and to endure the Paris agreements? Because it depends on us and people are relying on the next generations. How can we also avoid that disinformation and lack of information that comes from lack of transparency?
Yeah. So, I mean, you've hit the nail right on the head. Transparency really empowers the public, and it empowers citizens, and it empowers NGOs, non-governmental organizations like mine, like Environmental Defense Fund. When we have information, we can more effectively engage countries in this effort to reduce the impacts of climate change and to cut their emissions and their carbon pollution. So this really takes it takes commitment and energy from those who demand this of their representatives and their leaders. Now, this isn't something that is necessarily a hard thing for some countries to do, because a lot of countries realize that by giving information out, by gathering information and sharing it, they can enable better decision making. When they have that information, they can work more productively. They can assess their policies, what's working, what's not, and be more tailored and more efficient in what they do to solve policy challenges. And that's the same for climate change. If you have information about how your policies are working, what's not working well, you can improve. And that's what your constituencies demand of you as leaders. So if you can show how you're improving, you do better. So information is actually in the interest. Getting information is in the interest of countries. It's not always clear, or they don't always have the capacity to do that. But if they can build it up, if they can build up that capacity, and they can implement those information sharing and information gathering procedures, they will be in a better place because they'll make better decisions.
And it's also important to make sure that information reaches everyone, every youth, and that no one's left behind. How do you feel about that? Because many youth is left behind. How's your mind about that?
Yeah. Well, I think the engaging youth in this conversation is essential because you need new ideas too. And oftentimes when you bring new people into a conversation, you get new ideas. And there's a tremendous wealth of energy and commitment and ideas in our youth. And so tapping into those, I think, can help to make this process more effective and to help countries know that they have supporters who can help them to do better if they have the information they need.
Okay, thank you. You had a question.
My question is on this topic of transparency as well. Now, in terms of countries reaching their goals of the Paris Agreement and being effective members of the world, so I don't want to sound too political or anything, but from what I've heard or even read, some countries put up a front and say that they're achieving this and that, but technically numbers don't show it or actions don't show it. Is there any way to, I guess, regulate this or enforce stricter rules on said involved partners and members of the agreement?
Yeah. So the Paris Agreement is set up in a way that it's a bottom-up agreement. So countries come in with the contributions, the nationally determined contributions, the climate pledges that they feel they can do at that time. And the idea is by sharing information, by reviewing each other's performance, by giving ideas as to how they can do better, that can improve over time. But the key is you've got to have the right information. So if countries are saying something that doesn't match with what they're doing, there's that mismatch is, you've got to understand why that's happening. And I think part of it is because, there's a positive story here, right? Because what it shows is that countries really want to be perceived as doing well, right? They want that recognition. They want that approval, right? So the more you can create institutions and structures that highlight where those mismatches are, the more likely it is you're going to get the information to match what they're actually doing, and then for them to actually improve how they're performing. So it's a real challenge because countries will always want to say that they're doing great things. But I think the more that they can back it up with information, those countries are in a better position. Because if you're in a position as a country where you can say, I achieved this, and look, here's the proof, you're in a much better position than those countries that don't have any information. So that's why getting that information can also help countries, because they'll be in a better position if they can. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, of
It
course.
does, yeah.
It's just, it's frustrating, especially for the younger generation, to see 12 years is left until irreversible changes will happen. I study like animals for my schooling, zoology specific. So I'm very much involved with biodiversity and environment, and I find that in these conferences, a lot of focus is on human aspects, but I think we fail to realize that we're all interconnected. And if one fails, we're all going to fail together. But is there, I guess, do you feel hopeful?
So here's what gives me hope. What gives me hope is what's happening at the local level, and the kinds of things that you see and you're doing in your local communities, as happening at the provincial level or at the state level. In my country, in the U.S., there are very good things happening at the state level and the regional level. So just looking at what countries are doing as a whole and what they're saying here in this process, it doesn't give you a full picture of what's really happening on the ground back home. So there are all these stories to tell about what's really the good news that's going on, and these stories that can help others see how to do it. Because not everybody knows how to do it. We got to share that information that shows that there are barriers that can be overcome. We have the tools we need right now. That's what also we know what we need to do. We know we've got the clean energy technologies. We just need to deploy them more effectively. We know effective procedures to stop deforestation, empowering indigenous communities who live in these forests to protect their land. We know what the tools are, and we have the technology. The problem is that there is a lot of self-interest among those who are perpetuating the current kind of status quo. And the fossil fuel industry is a big part of that. There are strong economic interests in keeping the system as it is. But there is a lot of hope on the other side, pushing it the other direction. We just need to accelerate it a lot more.
One last question, sorry, just popped out when you were talking. As the more powerful nations, developed countries, how do you think we can actually help those in critical positions, the ones that are impoverished, the ones that are still developing, but they're the ones most affected by climate change? And I came from the Philippines, but I moved to Canada, and I went to the Philippines this summer, and I was just talking to them how you should keep the pristine environment as natural as possible, and they were kind of confused, and I elaborated saying, well, for example, pollution, try to keep these waters clean, and they're like, oh, well, it's far from here, it's not going to reach here. But that's not how the world works. So I think sharing information is valuable, but as developed countries, don't you think we should have projects to have outreach programs to educate these people who are gonna die first for climate change?
I mean, the vulnerable communities and countries are going to be the most impacted by climate change. And there is the perception that doing something on climate hurts your ability to grow economically. And I think that perception is starting to change, but it's still very ingrained. But I think more and more people are realizing that doing good for the environment is doing good for your economy too, because ultimately you can't have a healthy economy if you don't have a healthy environment. So I think that is changing, but it's still very hard, and the education levels and the ability to understand these connections is not always there. So there is a need for more cooperation, more international cooperation. It is happening. There are these channels where cooperation is taking place, but it needs to be. It's not enough.
Because what I find is a lot of them are either NGOs or volunteer-based or donation-based. I don't really see much of the governments doing efforts in educations like that. Do you think it'll happen soon? Or it'll take some time? Governments starting to become more invested in these efforts.
Part of the issue, I think, is they have so many competing demands on their resources. And so, like we talked about in this press conference, there is a need for capacity building. And there are funds out there to provide this capacity building. There are a number of channels where this capacity building can be supported. But sometimes the countries don't even know how to access them, or there are barriers to them getting that funding and that support. So, reducing those barriers to these good things happening is another thing that a lot of organizations are trying to break down.